Right now, inside every cell in your body, there is a molecule of DNA that has been copied, passed down, and protected across an unbroken chain of living organisms stretching back 3.8 billion years. Not one link has ever broken. Not once. Through asteroid impacts, ice ages, plagues, and volcanic winters that blocked the sun for years, that chain held. Every single one of your ancestors, going back to the very first replicating molecule in the primordial ocean, survived long enough to reproduce. Every single one. What that means in practice is that you are here right now because at least 5 times in the last 100,000 years, a catastrophe came along that should have erased your lineage from existence. And 5 times, someone in your family line, probably terrified, probably starving, probably surrounded by the bodies of everyone who didn't make it, stayed alive just long enough to have a child. This is that story. Not a ranking, not a list, a chain. The exact sequence of impossible survivals that had to happen in order for you to exist. Let's start at the moment the chain came closest to snapping entirely. 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in what is now northern Sumatra detonated in the largest volcanic eruption the Earth has experienced in the last 2 million years. To give you a sense of scale, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens released about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba released approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers. In a single event, the debris cloud spread across South and Southeast Asia, burying the Indian subcontinent under a layer of ash up to 6 meters thick. The particulates that reached the stratosphere blocked incoming solar radiation for somewhere between 6 and 10 years. Global average temperatures dropped by an estimated 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. In some regions, the drop was catastrophic, closer to 20 degrees. The photosynthesis that drives virtually every food chain on Earth stalled. Forests died, animals starved, rivers ran gray with ash. Early humans at this point had been anatomically modern for perhaps 200,000 years. But the total global population was already small. Perhaps a few 100,000 individuals scattered across Africa and parts of Asia. When the Toba winter hit, the population collapsed. Genetic studies published in the early 2000s, examining the mitochondrial DNA of living humans, found a severe reduction in genetic diversity, consistent with a population crash sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. The most cited estimates suggest the global human breeding population may have dropped to between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. That's the entire human species, the population of a small town, in the entire world. Your ancestor was in that group. We know this because you're here. Somewhere in Africa, a small cluster of people found enough shelter, enough surviving plant material, enough game animals that hadn't yet starved to keep going through years of ash sky and killing cold. We don't know their names. We don't know their faces, but we can read their survival in your genome. The lack of genetic diversity in modern humans, the fact that we are, as a species, far more genetically uniform than chimpanzees, is the scar that Toba left in your DNA. The first link almost didn't hold. 70,000 years later, your ancestors had rebuilt. Populations had grown. Humans had spread out of Africa, crossing into the Arabian Peninsula, moving into Asia, eventually reaching Europe. By 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last glacial maximum, Homo sapiens was a global species. But global didn't mean comfortable. The last ice age was not a gradual cooling. It was a sustained environmental catastrophe that lasted tens of thousands of years. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered much of North America and northern Eurasia. The North Sea didn't exist. You could walk from Britain to France. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. Average global temperatures were about 6 degrees Celsius colder than now. In the regions your ancestors occupied, winter wasn't a season. It was most of the year. Food was geographically sparse. Megafauna, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, short-faced bears were the primary large prey animals, and hunting them with the technology of 20,000 years ago required extraordinary coordination, planning, and courage. These were not symbolic dangers. A woolly mammoth weighed 6 to 8 tons. A cave lion was larger than the largest modern lion. Getting this wrong meant death, almost certainly. And yet, this is where the chain produced something extraordinary. The archaeological record from this period shows not just survival, but invention. The Gravettian culture, widespread across Europe and Asia between 33,000 and 22,000 years ago, produced the first known fired clay objects, sophisticated bone tools, and the earliest evidence of woven textiles. People living in mammoth bone houses on the Eurasian steppe developed fur layer clothing systems sophisticated enough that modern Arctic engineers, studying archaeological reconstructions, have found them thermally equivalent to the best modern cold-weather gear. Your ancestors didn't just endure the Ice Age, they engineered their way through it. The chain held. Then came the transition. Around 12,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. And the single most consequential decision in human history, a decision no individual made consciously, but that billions made collectively over centuries, reshaped the survival equation entirely. Agriculture. The standard telling frames agriculture as progress. The reality is more complicated. The first farmers, compared to the hunter-gatherers who preceded them, were shorter. Their skeletons show more evidence of childhood malnutrition. Their teeth were worse. They worked longer hours. They were more vulnerable to drought, flood, and crop failure. And crucially, for the first time in human history, they were living in permanent settlements dense enough for infectious disease to become epidemic. Analysis of skeletal remains from early agricultural communities in the Near East and Europe shows a dramatic increase in evidence of tuberculosis, leprosy, and other infectious diseases compared to pre-agricultural populations. Living alongside domesticated animals introduced zoonotic pathogens, diseases that crossed from animals to humans that hunter-gatherers rarely encountered. The world's great epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and eventually plague, all emerged or became devastating in the agricultural era. Your ancestor made it through anyway, possibly through acquired immunity, possibly through geography or luck. But the chain held, which brings us to the 14th century, and the single worst 4 years in recorded human history. The Black Death arrived in Europe in October 1347, aboard trading ships that docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors on board were dying or already dead, their bodies covered in black swollen lymph nodes, buboes, oozing blood and pus. Port authorities ordered the ships out of harbor immediately, but it was already too late. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had evolved a particularly brutal transmission mechanism. It lived in the digestive system of fleas. The fleas fed on rats. When the rat population in a given area collapsed, killed by the plague, fleas spread to whatever warm-blooded host was available. In medieval Europe in 1347, that host was everywhere. The death toll defies comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that between 30 and 40% of Europe's population died between 1347 and 1352. More aggressive estimates put it at 50 to 60%. In some cities, Florence, Venice, Paris, mortality rates exceeded 60%. Entire monastic communities were wiped out. Villages were abandoned. There were not enough living people to bury the dead. The mechanism of death was multi-pronged. Bubonic plague, the swollen lymph node form, had a mortality rate of 30 to 60% without treatment. Septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, was nearly 100% fatal within hours. Pneumonic plague, the airborne form, was 100% fatal without modern antibiotics and spread through respiratory droplets. A single infected person breathing in a crowded medieval alehouse could kill dozens. Your ancestor was in Europe or in the path of the plagues spread across Asia during this period. We know this because medieval genetic bottleneck signals are visible in some European population DNA, and yet they survived. Possibly they had a mutation in the CCR5 gene, the same mutation that today provides partial resistance to HIV, which appears to have been selected for strongly during the Black Death period. Or possibly they were geographically isolated. Possibly they simply weren't exposed when their neighbors were. The chain held. Again. Here is the thing about all of this that I want you to sit with. The Toba eruption, the last ice age, the agricultural disease transition, the Black Death. These were not the only crises. They were the largest, the most documented, the most dramatic. Between them were thousands of smaller filters, famines, wars, floods, droughts, plagues that killed hundreds rather than millions, predators, accidents, the simple, brutal arithmetic of childhood mortality in a world before medicine. Your family line passed through all of them, not through exceptional heroism, though some of your ancestors were undoubtedly brave, not through superior intelligence, though some were certainly clever, but through the same mechanism that has driven survival since the first molecule replicated: persistence, being in the right place, making the right choice, sometimes just not being the one the flea bit. You are not the product of destiny. You are the product of an unbroken chain of narrow escapes, stretching back further than the human mind can meaningfully comprehend. The next time something feels impossibly hard, remember what that chain has already survived. Subscribe, because this channel exists to tell the stories that chain passed through. And there are more of them than you can imagine.